At Atlanta International Airport, gate agent Melanie Reed's smug expression freezes as Isaiah and Zara Washington reveal their diplomatic passports. Security surrounds them after the confrontation. The airport manager appears completely changing demeanor upon seeing their credentials. Isaiah's phone buzzes with an urgent message about an international crisis requiring their immediate presence. Before we dive into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on stories about racial bias and justice. What would you do if you witnessed this situation? Let's continue to find out how this high-stakes confrontation began. The day had begun like many others for Isaiah Washington. At 42, the respected diplomat had grown accustomed to early mornings and urgent calls. But today felt different. The soft morning light filtered through the windows of their upscale Georgetown home in Washington, D.C., illuminating the framed degrees from Harvard that hung on the wall, reminders of the excellence both he and his wife Zara had achieved. "Have you seen my blue tie?" Isaiah called out, adjusting his tailored suit in the mirror. Not just any suit, but the kind that commanded respect in international circles. The kind that should have made people think twice before making assumptions about him. Zara Washington, 38, emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in a perfectly pressed navy pantsuit. As a human rights attorney whose reputation preceded her in courtrooms around the world, she knew the importance of appearance in spaces that weren't always welcoming to people who looked like her. "It's on the dresser," she replied, gesturing toward the silk tie. The secretary's office called again. "They've moved up the meeting by 2 hours. Isaiah checked his watch and frowned. "That doesn't give us much time. The situation must be deteriorating faster than they expected." The situation was a rapidly escalating conflict in a West African nation, one that threatened to destabilize an entire region if not addressed immediately. As one of the State Department's most experienced diplomats with 15 years of service, Isaiah had been specifically requested to lead the American delegation at the emergency United Nations session in Geneva. Zara, whose expertise in international human rights law made her invaluable in such crises, would be joining him. Their home phone rang, an unusual occurrence in the age of cell phones. Few people had that number, and even fewer would call it instead of their mobiles. Zara picked it up, her expression growing more serious as she listened. "It's for you," she said, handing the phone to Isaiah. "The secretary himself." Isaiah took the phone, his back straightening instinctively. "Yes, Mr. Secretary." The voice on the other end was terse, urgent. "Isaiah, we've got confirmed reports of mass graves. The regional peacekeeping force is threatening to pull out. If they do, we're looking at another Rwanda situation. The president has authorized extraordinary measures. There's a diplomatic pouch waiting for you at the airport with classified documentation. You need to be on that plane." "Understood, sir. We're leaving now." Isaiah hung up and turned to Zara, whose expression told him she'd heard enough to understand the gravity of the situation. "How bad?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Worst case scenario," he replied, grabbing his passport from the safe. Not his regular passport, but the black diplomatic passport with gold embossing that identified him as a representative of the United States government, traveling on official business with special clearances and immunities. Zara retrieved her identical one. They moved quickly around their spacious bedroom, packing essentials into carry-on luggage with practiced efficiency. They'd done this before, dropped everything to fly across the world to prevent or mitigate humanitarian disasters. It was the job they'd both committed their lives to, even when it came with unique challenges. "Did you pack the medication?" Zara asked, referring to Isaiah's blood pressure pills. The doctor had prescribed them last year, attributing the condition partially to the stress of Isaiah's position, though both of them suspected the constant microaggressions and need to be twice as good played their part too. "Got him," he confirmed, patting his breast pocket. Along with the backup thumb drives, their packing was interrupted by Isaiah's secure phone buzzing with a text from Tracy Coleman Their State Department liaison urgent intelligence update. Situation classified, level 4, military mobilizing. Geneva Committee convening at 0900 tomorrow. Confirmed departure. Isaiah quickly typed back, confirmed. En route to airport for ATL GVA flight. As they finished gathering their things, Zara paused at the framed photo on their dresser. Isaiah herself and their son Miles at his high school graduation. Miles was now a sophomore at Yale, following in his parents' Ivy League footsteps, despite the additional hurdles his generation still faced. "Should we call Miles?" she asked. Isaiah checked his watch again. "We'll call from the car. Lawrence should be here any minute." Right on cue, their doorbell rang. Lawrence Williams had been their assigned State Department driver for nearly 5 years. A former military man who took his responsibility of transporting government officials with the utmost seriousness. As they headed downstairs with their luggage, Isaiah's mind flashed to the previous week's incident at Reagan National Airport. Despite his well-tailored suit and government credentials, a passenger had asked him for directions to baggage claim, assuming he worked there. It wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. These moments never got easier, just more predictable. They opened the front door to find Lawrence looking uncharacteristically flustered. "My deepest apologies, sir, ma'am," he said, taking their bags. "There was an accident on the Beltway. I came as fast as I could." "It's fine, Lawrence," Isaiah reassured him, though they both knew that in their line of work even small delays could have significant consequences. As they settled into the black government sedan, Zara made the promised call to Miles, keeping the details vague as the call wasn't on a secure line. Isaiah, meanwhile, reviewed briefing documents on his encrypted tablet, absorbing the latest developments in a crisis that would soon consume all his attention. What neither of them knew was that the greatest challenge they would face that day wouldn't be in the war-torn country thousands of miles away, but in the airport they'd soon be rushing through, where the credentials they'd earned and the positions they held would be dismissed by someone who couldn't see past the color of their skin. The sleek government sedan navigated through Washington's morning traffic, with Lawrence doing his best to make up for lost time. Inside the vehicle, tension mounted with each passing minute. Isaiah's gaze shifted between his watch and the gridlocked cars ahead, calculating their dwindling margins. "We're hitting every red light," Lawrence said apologetically, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "I've never seen the parkway this backed up on a Tuesday." Zara glanced up from her tablet, where she'd been reviewing human rights violations reports from the crisis zone. "How far out are we from Reagan National?" At this rate, Lawrence grimaced. "At least 40 minutes, and you said your flight's at 1130. Isaiah exhaled slowly, a technique he'd learned to manage stress without showing it, a necessity in diplomatic circles, and unfortunately, in everyday life as a black man in positions of power. "We'll make it," he said, with more confidence than he felt. "We have to." His secure phone rang again. The caller ID displayed United Nations Secretary General's office. Isaiah Washington. He answered, his voice automatically shifting into what Zara called his diplomat tone. Authoritative, yet measured. "Mr. Washington," came a voice with a distinct French accent. "This is Antoine Dubois from the Secretary General's office. The situation has deteriorated further. We've received reports of military movements near the capital. Several embassies are evacuating personnel." "I understand," Isaiah replied, making eye contact with Zara, who immediately sensed the escalation. "We're en route to the airport now. Expected arrival in Geneva is approximately 6 a.m. local time tomorrow." "That may be too late," the voice responded bluntly. "The emergency session has been moved up. The Secretary General is requesting your presence as soon as humanly possible. There will be a private UN aircraft waiting for you in Atlanta to bring you directly to Geneva if your commercial flight is delayed." The call ended, and the weight of responsibility settled even more heavily on Isaiah's shoulders. Lives were literally at stake. Not just a few, but potentially thousands. "Lawrence," he said, leaning forward slightly, "is there any alternative route we could take? I can try cutting through Arlington, sir. It's not protocol, but given the circumstances, do it." Isaiah nodded. As Lawrence made a sharp turn to exit the main highway, Zara reached over and squeezed Isaiah's hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity they'd perfected over their 15 years of marriage. In their world, public displays of affection were rare, especially when on official business, but these small moments sustained them. "Remember that incident at LaGuardia last year?" Isaiah said, his mind circling back to a memory as Lawrence navigated through residential streets. Zara nodded, knowing exactly what he was referring to. When the airline staff insisted on checking your credentials 3 times while waving through everyone else at the priority boarding line. 3 times, Isaiah confirmed, straightening his tie. And the gate agent still had the audacity to ask if I was in the right line. I was in a full suit, holding a diplomatic passport and first-class boarding pass. These weren't just anecdotes for them. They were lived experiences that had shaped how they moved through the world. Despite their Harvard degrees, their distinguished careers, the respect they commanded in international forums, they still encountered these moments with disheartening regularity. Miles called it credentialism in his sociology paper, Zara recalled. The phenomenon where minorities need to constantly present and validate their credentials in spaces where others are presumed qualified. Isaiah nodded, remembering how proud they'd been of their son's insightful analysis, yet saddened that at 20 miles already understood these dynamics so intimately. His reflections were interrupted by another call, this time from Tracy Coleman at the State Department. "Isaiah," she began without preamble, "diplomatic security is concerned about your timeline. They're requesting you switch to the direct flight to Geneva from Dulles instead of the connecting flight through Atlanta." Isaiah exchanged glances with Zara before responding. "Tracy, we're already heading to Reagan. Turning around for Dulles would put us even further behind schedule. The Secretary General's office just called. They're arranging backup transportation from Atlanta if needed." There was a pause on the line. "Understood. I'll inform security. Your diplomatic escort will meet you at Reagan's priority check-in. Ambassador Harrington has been briefed and will be your point of contact in Geneva." As Lawrence continued navigating side streets, Zara noticed his nervous glances at the time. At this point, they were cutting it extremely close. "We're gonna make it," she said, with quiet determination, more for herself than for the others in the car. Isaiah nodded, though his thoughts had already moved ahead to what awaited them at the airport. He had learned through experience to expect complications, not because of international tensions or diplomatic protocols, but because of something much more fundamental: the assumptions people made when they saw a black man and woman, regardless of how they were dressed or what credentials they carried. "Just another day at the office," he murmured, an expression they often used between themselves to normalize the extraordinary nature of both their work and the additional hurdles they regularly faced. The sedan finally broke free from residential streets onto a clearer stretch of road leading to the airport. In the distance, planes took off and landed in a choreographed dance of global connectivity, a sight that usually filled Isaiah with a sense of purpose. Today it just reminded him of the ticking clock and the lives hanging in the balance halfway around the world. Lawrence pulled up to the departures level at Reagan National Airport with a screech of tires. "We're here, sir, ma'am. I'll handle the luggage." As they stepped out of the vehicle, Isaiah's phone buzzed one final time with a message from the Secretary of State himself. "Godspeed. The President is counting on you both." No pressure, Isaiah thought, as he straightened his suit jacket and prepared to navigate not just an international crisis, but the more immediate gauntlet of the airport. Isaiah and Zara strode purposefully through Reagan National's main entrance, the weight of their mission evident in their focused expressions. Immediately, they headed toward the VIP diplomatic entrance, a discreet doorway to the left of the main security checkpoint, designed specifically for government officials traveling on urgent business. "That's odd," Isaiah muttered as they approached the door, noting the maintenance sign and yellow caution tape blocking their usual entry point. A nearby TSA agent noticed their confusion. "VIP entrance is closed for electrical work, folks. Everyone's going through main security today." Isaiah displayed his diplomatic credentials. "We're on official State Department business. Is there an alternative protocol in place?" The agent shrugged with apparent indifference. "System's down on that side. You'll have to use the regular line like everyone else." Zara checked her watch. They now had less than 40 minutes until boarding. "Where's our diplomatic escort?" Tracy said. "Someone would meet us." Isaiah scanned the crowded terminal before pulling out his phone to call their State Department liaison. After a brief conversation, his expression tightened. "Apparently, our escort had a security clearance issue at the entrance. They're sending a replacement, but we don't have time to wait. We need to clear security now." They reluctantly joined the regular security line, which snaked back and forth through retractable barriers. Despite both of them having global entry and TSA pre-check, those expedited options wouldn't matter without access to the proper lanes. "This is exactly why we build in buffer time," Zara whispered, her calm exterior masking growing concern. In their 15 years working in international diplomacy, they'd learned that even the most carefully planned journeys could be derailed by unexpected obstacles, some circumstantial, others more deliberately placed in their path. When they finally reached the document check podium 20, precious minutes later, Isaiah presented their diplomatic passports and boarding passes to a TSA officer whose nameplate read Douglas Miller. Officer Miller studied their documents with exaggerated scrutiny, flipping through each page of their passports, while travelers with standard blue passports were quickly processed through adjacent lines. "Purpose of travel?" he asked, despite the diplomatic passports clearly indicating official government business. "Official State Department mission," Isaiah replied evenly. "We're due in Geneva for an emergency United Nations session." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'll need to verify these credentials. Please step aside." As they waited, Zara overheard a nearby traveler mutter to his companion, "Some people will try anything to cut the line." She maintained her composed expression, though her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. After several minutes, Miller returned with a supervisor who examined their documents again before finally nodding. "You're cleared to proceed to screening," the supervisor said, handing back their passports. "But you'll still need the standard security screening." Isaiah and Zara moved to the conveyor belt, removing their shoes and placing their carry-on bags on the scanner belt. Despite being frequent travelers who knew the drill perfectly, Officer Miller called out, "Make sure you remove all electronics and liquids." "Already done," Zara responded politely, indicating their perfectly organized bins. As Isaiah stepped through the metal detector, it remained silent. Nevertheless, Miller waved him aside. "Sir, you've been randomly selected for additional screening." Random. Isaiah repeated the word hanging in the air with unstated meaning as he noted the stream of other travelers proceeding without additional checks. While Miller conducted a pat-down and swabbed Isaiah's hands for explosive residue, Zara's phone rang. She answered to hear Tracy Coleman's increasingly concerned voice. "Where are you?" "Your flight starts boarding in 15 minutes, and your diplomatic pouches are waiting at the gate." "We got held up at security," Zara explained, watching as Isaiah was finally cleared. "We're just finishing now. Has our escort arrived?" "He's been waiting at the regular exit point for 20 minutes, Tracy replied with obvious frustration. "Gate 37B, by the way. It's at the far end of Terminal C." Isaiah rejoined Zara, and they gathered their belongings quickly. "We need to run," he said simply. They rushed through the terminal carry-on bags in tow, navigating through crowds of leisurely travelers. Despite the urgency they maintained, an outward appearance of calm dignity. Years of diplomatic training had taught them that losing composure publicly was never an option, especially not for Black professionals in positions of prominent authority. As they hurried, Isaiah's mind flashed to the many times they'd encountered these random delays in airports across America, delays their white colleagues somehow never experienced with the same frequency. Each incident was technically explainable in isolation, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who cared to notice. They spotted their diplomatic escort agent Kevin Prescott anxiously checking his watch near a newsstand. He was holding a sealed diplomatic pouch with classified documents they would need for the Geneva conference. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington," he called, rushing toward them. "We need to move quickly. Your flight is priority boarding right now." "Lead the way," Isaiah said, taking the diplomatic pouch and securing it inside his jacket. As they speed-walked through the terminal, Zara's phone rang again. The screen displayed UN Secretary General's office. "This is Zara Washington," she answered, slightly breathless from their pace. "Mrs. Washington, we have new intelligence reports that require immediate briefing. Can you speak freely?" "Negative," she replied, using the protocol word to indicate she was in a public space. "We're en route to the gate now." "Understood." The situation has escalated to Category 1. Military action appears imminent without intervention. The Secretary General is personally requesting your presence at the earliest possible moment. The call ended as they approached the final stretch to their gate. The departure board showed their flight to Atlanta was still on time, with the connection to Geneva leaving Atlanta 3 hours after their scheduled arrival. The margins were tight but still feasible, if nothing else went wrong. As Gate 37B came into view, Agent Prescott pointed to the counter. "They're finishing priority boarding now. I've already alerted them to your status." Isaiah and Zara approached the gate, diplomatic passports and boarding passes in hand, the weight of international crisis on their shoulders, and yet another hurdle about to present itself in what should have been the straightforward process of boarding an airplane. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal as Isaiah and Zara Washington approached Gate 37B, diplomatic escort trailing slightly behind them. Despite the clear urgency of their situation, Gate Agent Melanie Reed, a young woman with pin-straight blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail, barely glanced up from her computer terminal as they approached. "We need to board immediately," Isaiah said, presenting their first-class boarding passes and diplomatic passports. "We're connecting to an international flight." Melanie's eyes flicked up briefly, then returned to her screen. "I'm sorry, but the doors are closed," she stated flatly, despite the obvious activity of passengers still moving down the jet bridge behind her. "As you can see," Zara pointed out calmly, "other passengers are still boarding. Those passengers were already in line." Melanie replied, her tone shifting to one of rehearsed regret that didn't reach her eyes. "Company policy. Once final call is announced, we can't accept new passengers." Isaiah maintained his diplomatic composure, the same measured tone he'd used in negotiations with hostile foreign officials. "We're traveling on official government business. Our connection in Atlanta is for an emergency United Nations session in Geneva." Melanie's expression changed subtly, a flicker of disbelief crossing her features as her eyes darted between them and their passports. "You're diplomats?" The question carried an unmistakable note of skepticism. "Yes," Isaiah confirmed, pointing to the gold-embossed diplomatic identifiers on their black passports. "United States Diplomatic Corps, State Department. This is an urgent matter of international security." Another gate agent, a middle-aged man whose name tag read Brian Turner, glanced over with growing interest at the exchange. Meanwhile, passengers still queuing to board were beginning to take notice of the confrontation, some openly staring, others pretending not to watch. "I'd need to see additional identification," Melanie stated, pushing their passports back across the counter. "These don't look standard." "They're not standard," Zara explained with professional patience. "They're diplomatic passports, black covers, not blue." They identify us as official representatives of the United States government. I've never seen these before, Melanie insisted, her voice rising slightly. I can't just let anyone on the plane who claims to be a diplomat. Isaiah took a measured breath. Would you like to see our State Department credentials as well? Or perhaps you'd prefer to call your supervisor. He kept his tone measured, aware of the growing audience behind them. From the jet bridge entrance, flight attendant Marshall Peterson noticed the developing situation. Unlike Melanie, his expression shifted to one of recognition when he spotted the diplomatic passports. He started moving toward the counter, only to halt when Melanie's hand moved toward the phone at her station. I'm calling security, she announced, picking up the receiver without breaking eye contact with the Washingtons. Please step aside. That won't be necessary, Isaiah stated firmly. We are legitimate government officials on urgent business. Your airline has been notified of our travel status. Melanie ignored him, speaking into the phone. Security to gate 37B. I have 2 individuals attempting to board with suspicious documentation. Zara, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the escalating situation, reached for her phone. I'm contacting our State Department liaison now. This is completely inappropriate. Within minutes, a security officer named James Wilson approached briskly, hand resting near his holster. He immediately positioned himself beside Melanie, facing the Washingtons. What seems to be the problem here? Before either Isaiah or Zara could respond, Melanie jumped in. These people are trying to board with some kind of fake government IDs. They're insisting on getting on the plane after doors are closed. Wilson's gaze hardened as it fell on Isaiah and Zara, making an immediate assessment that seemed based on something other than the facts at hand. Sir, ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the counter. Officer Wilson. Isaiah began reading the man's nameplate. There's been a misunderstanding. We're State Department diplomats on official business. Your colleague is mistaken about both our credentials and the boarding status. Passengers are still actively boarding this flight. Zara had begun recording the interaction on her phone, a practice they'd reluctantly adopted after similar incidents in the past. We've presented valid diplomatic passports and boarding passes. We're en route to an emergency United Nations session. By now, the scene had drawn significant attention. The remaining passengers in line were openly watching their reactions, a spectrum of uncomfortable awareness. Some shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered to companions. A few recorded the encounter on their phones. Among the observers, the responses revealed their own biases. An older white couple shook their heads, muttering about people always making scenes at airports. A young black woman watched with visible tension, her expression suggesting this scene was all too familiar. A middle-aged Asian man in a business suit frowned deeply, his gaze moving between the diplomatic passports and the security officer's dismissive posture. I'll need to see those documents, Officer Wilson demanded, extending his hand. Isaiah handed over their passports again, maintaining eye contact with Wilson. As you'll see, these are legitimate diplomatic passports. We're representatives of the United States government. Wilson flipped through the passports with evident skepticism. Meanwhile, Melanie crossed her arms, her expression suggesting she'd already made up her mind regardless of what the document showed. The diplomatic escort Agent Prescott finally pushed forward. Excuse me, I'm Agent Kevin Prescott with Diplomatic Security Service. These are indeed United States diplomats on priority travel status. Wilson glanced at Prescott's credentials, his certainty wavering slightly. Then why weren't they pre-boarded? And why doesn't she recognize their passports? He nodded toward Melanie. That's a question for the airline, Prescott replied. But I can absolutely verify their identities and the urgency of their mission. As this exchange continued, a second security officer approached. Airport Police Officer Keith Dawson. Unlike Wilson, his hand wasn't merely resting near his weapon. It was directly on it, his posture suggesting he was responding to a potential threat rather than a documentation question. "What's the situation?" Dawson asked Wilson, his gaze fixed intently on Isaiah. "These individuals are attempting to board with what they claim are diplomatic passports," Wilson explained, still holding the documents. Zara noticed Dawson's hand position and spoke clearly for her recording. "Officer, I want to note that you've approached us with your hand on your weapon, though we've been nothing but professional and cooperative." Dawson's expression flickered with momentary self-consciousness, but he didn't move his hand. Isaiah, drawing on years of diffusing tense international situations, spoke with deliberate calm. "Officers, we understand you're doing your job. However, there seems to be confusion about standard diplomatic travel protocols. Perhaps we could speak with an airport manager or airline supervisor to resolve this quickly. Our connecting flight to Geneva is for an urgent diplomatic mission." The mention of a supervisor seemed to trigger something in Melanie. "They've been argumentative from the start," she interjected quickly. "And those passports don't look real to me." "Have you ever seen a diplomatic passport before today?" Zara asked her directly. Melanie's hesitation answered the question before she could. At that moment, Flight Attendant Marshall Peterson stepped fully into the situation. "Miss Reed, those are indeed diplomatic passports. I've seen them before with government travelers. And we are absolutely still boarding. We haven't even started final cabin checks yet." The confrontation had reached a critical juncture. Isaiah and Zara Washington, Harvard-educated diplomats with 15 years of distinguished service, stood surrounded by security personnel at an airport gate, their identities and authority openly questioned, despite clear credentials, while passengers continued boarding the very flight they were being told was closed. Have you ever witnessed racial profiling in a public setting? Comment number 1. If you believe Melanie is treating this situation differently because of racial bias. Like and subscribe to see how this intense confrontation reaches its breaking point. Was Officer Dawson justified in approaching with his hand on his weapon? What do you think happens next when the Washingtons reveal exactly who they are? The truth will shock you. The tension at Gate 37B had become palpable as Officer Dawson maintained his confrontational stance, still not removing his hand from his weapon, despite the professional demeanor of the Washingtons. Passengers who had been waiting to board now openly stared at the unfolding scene, many with phones raised to capture the confrontation. "I'm going to need verification of these documents," Officer Wilson stated, holding the diplomatic passports at an angle that suggested suspicion rather than respect for official government identification. Isaiah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his growing frustration. As the lead negotiator for numerous international peace accords, he had faced down warlords and dictators without losing his composure. He wouldn't lose it now. "Officer Wilson," he said with measured precision, "those are United States diplomatic passports issued by the State Department. They contain biometric chips, watermarks, and security features that verify their authenticity. If you're unfamiliar with how to verify them, I suggest contacting the State Department's Diplomatic Security Office." Zara, still recording the encounter on her phone, noticed a shift in the crowd's energy. Several passengers had stepped out of the boarding line, some shaking their heads in visible discomfort at what they were witnessing. "I'm going to have to ask you to stop recording," Officer Dawson suddenly demanded, taking a step towards Zara. "I'm within my legal rights to record this interaction," she responded calmly, her background as a human rights attorney evident in her confident assertion. "I'm not interfering with your duties, merely documenting this encounter for the record." Melanie, the gate agent, leaned toward Officer Wilson. "They're holding up the boarding process," she said loud enough for others to hear, despite the fact that she had been the one to claim boarding was already complete. The diplomatic escort, Agent Prescott, attempted to intervene again. "Officers, I can verify that Mr. and Mrs. Washington are indeed who they claim to be. I'm their designated diplomatic security service escort." Officer Wilson finally turned his attention to Prescott's credentials, examining them with the same exaggerated scrutiny he had applied to the diplomatic passports. Meanwhile, Isaiah's secure phone vibrated in his pocket. Without breaking eye contact with Officer Dawson, he slowly reached for it. "I'm taking out my phone to respond to what is likely an urgent diplomatic communication," he stated clearly, making his movements deliberate and transparent. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Dawson ordered sharply, his hand now fully gripping his weapon. The response was so disproportionate to Isaiah's calm statement that audible gasps came from several onlookers. A middle-aged black woman in the boarding line shook her head and muttered, "This is exactly what we go through," before being quieted by her traveling companion. Isaiah froze his expression, revealing nothing, while his mind flashed to the conversation he'd had with his son, Miles, about how to behave when confronted by law enforcement. A talk no diplomat should need to have with their child yet. One that remained necessary, despite all their achievements. "My husband just informed you he was reaching for his State Department secure phone," Zara stated firmly, her legal training evident in her precise language. "Your response is excessive and inappropriate." Brian Turner, the other gate agent who had been watching the situation escalate, finally stepped forward. "Maybe we should call a supervisor," he suggested to Melanie, who shot him a look of betrayal. From the jetway flight attendant, Marshal Peterson had been joined by the aircraft's Captain Derek Bennett, who assessed the situation with a frown. "What's the delay here? We have a schedule to maintain." "These individuals are attempting to board with questionable documentation," Officer Wilson explained, still holding the diplomatic passports. Captain Bennett extended his hand. "May I see the documents in question?" Wilson hesitated before handing them over. The captain examined the passports briefly, his expression changing to one of recognition. "These are diplomatic passports," he stated matter-of-factly. "We transport government officials regularly." "That's what they claim," Melanie interjected, her voice higher than before. "But they arrived after final boarding call. And I've never seen passports like that. We have multiple witnesses who can confirm boarding was still actively in progress," Zara pointed out, gesturing to the passengers still watching the scene unfold. A young woman in line nodded emphatically. "People were definitely still boarding. I've been standing here the whole time." Isaiah, who had remained perfectly still since Officer Dawson's command, spoke with a measured tone that had diffused international crises. "Captain Bennett, we are United States diplomats en route to Geneva for an emergency United Nations session regarding a developing humanitarian crisis. Our connecting flight leaves from Atlanta in 3 hours. Every minute of delay here potentially impacts international security matters." The mention of an international security matter seemed to finally register with Officer Wilson, whose posture shifted slightly. "I still need to verify these documents through proper channels." "Then I suggest you do so immediately," Isaiah replied, "and I would appreciate if Officer Dawson would remove his hand from his weapon, as we have presented no threat whatsoever." Dawson's hand remained in place as he responded defensively, "Standard security protocol." "Is it standard protocol to place your hand on your weapon when confronting unarmed diplomatic personnel presenting valid identification?" Zara asked pointedly, still recording. The question hung in the air, highlighting the disparity in treatment that no amount of credentials, education, or status had managed to overcome. Isaiah's mind flashed to similar situations they'd faced over the years. The time they were stopped 3 separate times while driving their diplomatic vehicle through Virginia. The upscale restaurant in Boston, where they were repeatedly asked if they were in the right place, despite having reservations. The department store security that followed Zara, even as she shopped in designer sections. Each incident existing in a pattern too consistent to be coincidental, too painful to be forgotten. The radio on Officer Wilson's shoulder crackled to life. "Wilson, this is dispatch. We've got a call from State Department Diplomatic Security regarding personnel at Gate 37B. Please verify and report." Wilson responded into his radio, Dispatch. I'm currently verifying credentials for 2 individuals claiming diplomatic status. They're not claiming anything, Agent Prescott interjected firmly. They are United States diplomats as their passports and my credentials confirm. As if on cue, Isaiah's secure phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. I need to answer this, he stated. It's likely regarding the international situation we're traveling to address. Go ahead, Captain Bennett authorized, overriding any potential objection from the security officers. Isaiah slowly retrieved his phone, noting the caller ID, Secretary of State. This is Isaiah Washington, he answered, his voice shifting to its formal diplomatic cadence. The voice on the other end was loud enough that those standing nearby could hear portions of the conversation. Isaiah, where are you? The President is asking for updates on your departure status. The situation is deteriorating by the minute. Mr. Secretary, we're currently experiencing some unexpected delays at our departure gate. Isaiah responded with diplomatic understatement. Airport security seems to be having difficulty verifying our credentials. There was a brief pause before the Secretary's voice came through again, noticeably louder. Put me on speaker. Isaiah complied, holding the phone where everyone could hear. This is the United States Secretary of State, the authoritative voice announced. To whom am I speaking? The atmosphere at Gate 37B shifted instantly. Officer Wilson straightened to attention almost reflexively. This is Security Officer James Wilson at Reagan National Airport, sir. Officer Wilson, I'm calling to confirm that Isaiah and Zara Washington are senior diplomatic envoys traveling on official government business of the highest priority. The President has personally authorized their mission. Any delay in their departure constitutes a matter of national security. Am I making myself clear? Wilson swallowed visibly. Yes, sir. Crystal clear, sir. Excellent. Now, who is the ranking airline representative present? Captain Bennett stepped forward. This is Captain Derek Bennett, sir. Captain Bennett, I trust you'll ensure the Washington's board immediately and that their connecting flight in Atlanta is secured regardless of any delays this incident may have caused. Yes, Mr. Secretary. We'll see to it personally. Thank you. Isaiah, call me when you're airborne. The line went dead. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ambient noise of the terminal and the soft murmurs from the crowd of witnesses. Officer Dawson's hand had finally dropped from his weapon. Melanie's face had drained of color. Officer Wilson stood holding the diplomatic passports with a completely transformed demeanor. The confrontation had reached its breaking point, but the incident was far from over. For Isaiah and Zara Washington, this was merely the latest chapter in a lifetime of having to prove their legitimacy in spaces where others were given the benefit of the doubt. The difference being that this time, the highest levels of chapters of Special Station government had been drawn into yet another example of what they faced, simply trying to do their jobs. The silence that had fallen over Gate 37B after the Secretary of State's call lasted only moments before Isaiah Washington reached inside his jacket pocket. With deliberate movements, he withdrew not only his diplomatic passport, which Officer Wilson was still awkwardly holding, but also a special red-bordered State Department identification card with gold embossing that few civilians would ever see. This he said calmly, holding up the ID identifies me as a special diplomatic envoy with alpha-level security clearance appointed directly by the President of the United States. Zara similarly produced her matching credentials, laying them on the counter next to her diplomatic passport. And these are my United Nations credentials confirming my status as Special Human Rights Counsel to the U.S. Diplomatic mission. The official weight of these identifications was not lost on Captain Bennett, whose expression shifted from concern to something approaching awe. Even Officers Wilson and Dawson seemed to deflate as they processed the significance of who they had been detaining. Melanie Reed, the gate agent whose refusal had triggered the entire confrontation, stared at the credentials, with her mouth slightly agape. the color draining from her face as she realized the magnitude of her error. I didn't know," she stammered. Her previous confidence evaporated. "These aren't the usual government IDs we see." "That's because they aren't usual," Isaiah stated evenly. "They're diplomatic credentials held by fewer than 200 individuals in the entire United States government." Officer Wilson's radio crackled again, this time with unmistakable urgency. "Wilson, this is dispatch. We have confirmation from State Department and Diplomatic Security. Priority clearance authorized for Washington Party. Airport director en route to your location. Acknowledge." "Acknowledged," Wilson responded, his voice notably subdued compared to his previous authoritative tone. As if on cue, the crowd at the gate parted to reveal Airport Manager Leonard Phillips rushing toward them, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Behind him trailed several airline officials in corporate attire, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed panic. Mr. and Mrs. Washington Phillips began slightly out of breath. "I'm Leonard Phillips, Director of Operations for Reagan National. I've just been briefed on this situation and want to personally apologize for this inexcusable misunderstanding." Isaiah maintained his diplomatic composure, though years of navigating such misunderstandings had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and damage control. Philip's frantic energy suggested the latter. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Phillips," Isaiah replied. "However, what concerns me more is that despite presenting valid diplomatic credentials, we were treated with suspicion, threatened, and delayed from boarding a flight that is clearly still in the boarding process." He gestured toward the jet bridge where passengers continued to queue. Zara, who had stopped recording once the situation de-escalated, added with the precision of a seasoned attorney, "This incident will require formal review." Officer Dawson placed his hand on his weapon, despite no threat being presented. "That represents an excessive response that cannot be dismissed as standard procedure." Phillips nodded rapidly. "Absolutely. A full investigation will be conducted. In the meantime, please allow us to escort you aboard immediately." He turned to the airline officials. "Make sure their connecting flight in Atlanta is secured regardless of any delay this causes." One of the corporate-suited individuals stepped forward. "We've already contacted our Atlanta operations. A private escort will meet your flight at the gate to ensure seamless transfer. We're deeply sorry for this incident." As this exchange occurred, Melanie Reed seemed to shrink behind her counter, her earlier defiance replaced by visible dread. Brian Turner, the other gate agent, shot her a look that clearly communicated, "I told you so." Officer Wilson awkwardly returned the diplomatic passports, now handling them with exaggerated care. "Sir, ma'am, on behalf of airport security, I apologize for the confusion." Officer Dawson notably remained silent, his expression unreadable as he stood slightly apart from the group. Just as the apologies concluded, Isaiah's phone rang again. The caller ID displayed "Situation Room." He answered immediately. "Washington." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "Secure line priority 1. The President has been briefed on your delay and the circumstances. He's requested an update on your status." Isaiah's gaze swept across the now deferential faces surrounding him. "We're boarding momentarily. Anticipated arrival in Geneva remains on schedule, assuming no further impediments." "Understood. The Secretary of State will call again once you're airborne. The situation has escalated to level 5. Military forces are mobilizing on both sides of the conflict zone." "Copy that. We'll be ready for the briefing." Isaiah ended the call and turned to Zara, their eyes meeting in silent communication developed over years of partnership in both marriage and diplomacy. Without another word needing to be exchanged, Captain Bennett personally gestured toward the jet bridge. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington, if you'll follow me, I'll escort you to your seats myself." As they moved toward the aircraft, the crowd of onlookers parted, many watching, with expressions ranging from sympathy to embarrassment to vindication. The young black woman who had commented earlier caught Zara's eye, and gave an almost imperceptible nod of solidarity, a gesture that spoke volumes about shared experiences. Behind them, they could hear Airport Director Phillips already launching into what sounded like a stern reprimand of Melanie Reed, whose voice had risen to a defensive pitch. "How was I supposed to know? I've never seen those types of passports before." Phillips's response was measured but firm. That's exactly why protocol requires escalation to a supervisor when presented with unfamiliar official documentation, not calling security and making accusations. Isaiah and Zara boarded the aircraft with a composed dignity that had carried them through countless international negotiations, crisis zones, and yes, episodes of bias, much like this one. As they settled into their first-class seats, the weight of what had just transpired hung between them, alongside the even heavier responsibility of the mission that awaited them in Geneva. Captain Bennett personally ensured their comfort before returning to the cockpit, while Flight Attendant Marshall Peterson approached with visible contrition. "On behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize," he said quietly. "I should have intervened sooner." "You did intervene," Zara acknowledged. "That's more than most would do." As the final passengers boarded, giving curious glances toward the couple whose confrontation many had witnessed, Isaiah's phone buzzed with a text message from the Secretary of State. POTUS informed, "Full diplomatic incident report requested upon your return. Focus on mission now. Nation counting on you both." The revelation of exactly who the Washingtons were had transformed the entire dynamic at Gate 37B in seconds. From suspected imposters to presidential envoys, from being met with suspicion to deference. Yet for Isaiah and Zara, the bitter irony remained that their credentials, education, position, and even direct line to the president hadn't initially been enough to overcome the most fundamental bias of all. The atmosphere in first class was charged with an uncomfortable energy as Isaiah and Zara Washington settled into their seats. Flight attendants moved with exaggerated courtesy around them, offering premium services before they were even requested. Captain Bennett had made a special trip from the cockpit to personally welcome them aboard, a gesture practically unheard of in commercial aviation. "We've received clearance for priority takeoff," he informed them quietly. "We'll make up the delay en route to Atlanta." Isaiah nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Captain. That's very helpful." As the final boarding procedures continued, the Washingtons could feel the weight of stares from other passengers, some curious, others embarrassed to have witnessed the confrontation, and a few openly supportive. A distinguished older black gentleman across the aisle caught Isaiah's eye and gave a subtle nod of recognition. No words were needed. The shared understanding of what had transpired spoke volumes. Zara placed her diplomatic pouch securely under the seat in front of her, her movements measured and precise, despite the lingering tension in her shoulders. Years of international crisis management had taught her to compartmentalize emotions, but experiences like today's cut through professional defenses in ways that war zones sometimes couldn't. Water before takeoff. A flight attendant appeared at her side, offering a crystal glass on a small tray. "Thank you," Zara replied, accepting it with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to diplomatic functions. Meanwhile, through the cabin windows, they could see Airport Manager Leonard Phillips still on the jetway, engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Melanie Reed. The gate agent's body language had transformed completely. Her previous confidence replaced by defensive posturing, as Phillips gestured emphatically. Inside the terminal beyond them, Officers Wilson and Dawson stood with their supervisor, whose animated expression suggested they were receiving a similar reprimand. Agent Prescott, their diplomatic escort, was providing what appeared to be a formal statement to another official. "It's always the aftermath," Isaiah murmured to Zara, quietly enough that only she could hear. She nodded, understanding his meaning perfectly. The pattern was familiar: incident, revelation, apologies, consequences, but never prevention. Never systemic change that might have avoided the situation altogether. As the last passengers boarded, a flurry of activity near the aircraft door caught their attention. A breathless airline representative in a corporate suit hurried down the aisle toward them, clutching a leather portfolio. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington," she began, slightly winded. "I'm Catherine Martinez, Customer Experience Director for the airline. I've been dispatched from our headquarters to personally address the unfortunate incident that occurred." Isaiah exchanged a brief glance with Zara before responding. "That was a quick response, Miss Martinez. The Secretary of State's office contacted our CEO directly," she explained, lowering her voice. "I've been instructed to inform you that Miss Reed has been removed from duty pending a full investigation, and that we've implemented immediate measures to ensure your connecting flight in Atlanta is secured regardless of our arrival time." She opened her portfolio, removing official letterhead. "Additionally, I have a formal letter of apology from our chief executive and confirmation that the airline will be making a substantial donation to the Diplomatic Children's Education Fund that I understand you established." The reference to their foundation, created to help minority students pursue careers in international relations, suggested just how thoroughly they had been researched in the brief time since the incident. Corporate damage control was moving at impressive speed. "That's appreciated, Miss Martinez," Zara replied, her tone professional but reserved. "Though I hope the focus remains on the systemic issues rather than just addressing our specific case." Martinez nodded earnestly. "Absolutely. In fact, our diversity and inclusion team has already requested a meeting with State Department officials to review protocols for diplomatic travelers. We're taking this very seriously." As Martinez continued detailing the airline's response plans, Isaiah's attention was drawn to his secure phone, which had lit up with a message from Tracy Coleman at the State Department. "Incident has reached Secretary's desk. Media inquiries already coming in. Passenger videos circulating. Need statement from you post-landing." The realization that their experience had already begun spreading beyond the airport added another layer of complexity to an already complicated day. Isaiah and Zara had never sought to be symbols or examples, yet situations like this repeatedly thrust them into that role. Martinez finished her practiced apology and retreated as the aircraft door finally closed. The relief of imminent departure was palpable, though the 70-minute flight to Atlanta would hardly provide enough time to process what had occurred, much less prepare for the high-stakes diplomatic mission awaiting them in Geneva. As the safety demonstration began, Zara leaned closer to Isaiah. "Should we file the formal complaint now or wait until after Geneva?" It was a question that carried more weight than its simple wording suggested. Filing an official diplomatic incident report would trigger mandatory reviews, investigations, and potential disciplinary actions. It would create a record that might prevent similar occurrences for others, but it would also require their time and attention at a moment when a humanitarian crisis demanded their full focus. Isaiah considered for a moment before responding. "Let's draft it now while it's fresh, submit after the mission is complete." The right thing done at the wrong time can sometimes do more harm than good. Zara nodded her agreement, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. They had learned through years of diplomatic service when to press forward and when strategic patience would yield better results. The aircraft began pushing back from the gate, and Isaiah found himself making eye contact with a young black flight attendant who hadn't been involved in the gate incident. Something in her expression, a mixture of pride and solidarity, reminded him of what their visibility meant to others who rarely saw people like themselves in positions of diplomatic power. "You know," he said quietly to Zara as the plane taxied toward the runway 15 years ago when we accepted these positions, "I never imagined that one of our most challenging negotiations would be simply boarding an airplane in our own country." Zara's hand found his, a rare public display of affection they typically reserved for private moments. And yet, here we are, still showing up, still doing the work. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting them toward Atlanta, and ultimately to the international crisis that demanded their expertise. The weight of dual responsibilities settled over them, representing America to the world, while simultaneously challenging America to live up to its promises at home. The incident at Gate 37B would soon be documented in official reports, perhaps briefly featured in news cycles, and eventually added to the institutional memory of yet another misunderstanding involving credentials that shouldn't have needed verification in the first place. But for now, there was a more immediate crisis, demanding their attention. One where lives hung in the balance, and their unique diplomatic skills were urgently needed. The aircraft climbed through the clouds, leaving Reagan National Airport behind, though the experience would travel with them as it always did. Another chapter in their ongoing navigation of excellence, despite exceptions of service, despite slights of patriotism, despite prejudice. The aircraft reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and a tense sort of normalcy settled over the first-class cabin. Flight attendant Marshall Peterson, who had witnessed the gate confrontation, approached with particular attentiveness. "May I bring you anything? Perhaps a drink after? Everything that happened." He lowered his voice on the last part, conscious of nearby passengers. "Just water for me," Isaiah responded. "And perhaps some coffee for my wife." "Make that tea if you have it," Zara corrected. "Earl Grey if possible." As Peterson moved away to fulfill their requests, Isaiah's secure phone vibrated with incoming messages. Unlike the urgent calls from before, these were reactions to what had transpired at the gate. News traveled fast through diplomatic and government circles. The first message was from their son Miles, at Yale. "Mom just called me. You both okay? Video already on Twitter. Love you both." The reference to video confirmed what they had suspected. Passengers had recorded the confrontation and footage was already circulating online. In the age of viral content, incidents like theirs rarely remain private for long. Another message appeared from Dr. Marcus Johnson, their longtime friend, and the Deputy Secretary of State. "Just saw what happened. Disgraceful. Secretary has ordered full diplomatic security detail to meet you in Atlanta. Call when you can." Zara glanced at Isaiah's screen and sighed. "It's beginning," she said softly. It needed no elaboration between them. The cycle was familiar: incident exposure, public outcry, institutional promises, gradual fading of attention, and eventual return to the status quo, until the next incident restarted the process. Peterson returned with their drinks, placing them carefully on the premium linen cocktail napkins. "The captain asked me to inform you that we've been granted priority handling all the way to Atlanta. We should arrive ahead of schedule, which should help with your connection." "Thank you." Isaiah acknowledged, noticing how the flight attendant's eyes kept darting toward his diplomatic passport, now visible in his breast pocket. The revelation of their status had transformed ordinary service into something approaching reverence. Another stark reminder of how quickly perceptions could shift once credentials were verified. As Peterson retreated, Zara opened her laptop and began typing rapidly. "I'm documenting everything while it's still fresh," she explained. "Times, names, exact statements. For the official report." Isaiah nodded, pulling out his own secure tablet to review briefing documents on the West African crisis they were racing to address. The ability to compartmentalize, to simultaneously process personal indignity while focusing on global concerns, had become second nature over their 15-year diplomatic careers. His concentration was interrupted by another message, this one from Secretary of State William Harrington himself. "Just spoke with POTUS about the airport incident. He's livid. Wants to call you personally. Advised him to wait until after Geneva. Media team monitoring situation. Focus on the mission for now. We'll address this properly upon your return." The secretary's message was followed immediately by a news alert: diplomatic incident at Reagan. National State Department officials reportedly profiled. Isaiah showed the screen to Zara, whose expression remained carefully neutral, despite the flicker of recognition in her eyes. This wasn't their first experience becoming unwitting symbols in America's ongoing reckoning with racial bias. We should prepare a statement, she suggested pragmatically, something brief that acknowledges without inflaming. The mission has to remain priority. Isaiah began drafting text on his tablet. We appreciate the concerns regarding an incident at Reagan National Airport. As diplomatic representatives currently en route to address an urgent international humanitarian situation, we are focused on that critical mission. We look forward to addressing other matters upon our return. Zara reviewed his draft, making a few small adjustments before nodding her approval. Send this to Tracy for distribution if needed. As Isaiah forwarded the statement to their State Department liaison, his mind drifted to conversations they'd had with their son Miles throughout his childhood, especially the painful but necessary discussions about navigating a world that would often judge him by his appearance before his character or credentials. Remember when Miles was 13, he said quietly to Zara, and came home upset because his history teacher seemed surprised he knew about the Yalta Conference. Zara's expression softened at the memory. And you told him that sometimes the greatest diplomacy happens not across international borders, but across the small spaces between people's expectations and our reality. He's using that line in his thesis, Isaiah noted with a touch of pride, examining diplomatic frameworks as models for addressing domestic social challenges. Their conversation was interrupted by another message, this one from an unexpected source. President David Monroe himself, Isaiah Zara, just briefed on airport incident. Unacceptable. You represent the best of America to the world. We'll discuss upon your return. For now, know you have my full confidence for Geneva. Country is counting on you both. The presidential message underscored the strange dichotomy of their position, valued at the highest levels of government for their expertise and experience, yet still subject to the most basic forms of bias in everyday interactions. You know what the hardest part is? Zara said, her voice kept deliberately low, explaining to international counterparts why the country we represent with such pride and conviction still struggles with these fundamental issues of equality and perception. Isaiah nodded, remembering numerous uncomfortable moments during overseas postings. Iranian diplomats pointedly asking about police brutality statistics during nuclear negotiations. Chinese officials bringing up racial disparities in incarceration rates while discussing human rights violations. European colleagues expressing concern about America's ongoing social divisions. It's the diplomatic version of clean up your own house, he acknowledged. Makes it harder to stand on principle internationally when domestic inconsistencies are so evident. Their reflections were interrupted by Captain Bennett's voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Atlanta. We've made up the time from our delayed departure and will be arriving approximately 10 minutes ahead of schedule. The announcement prompted another flurry of activity from the cabin crew, who seemed especially attentive to the Washington's needs as they prepared for landing. This heightened service, a direct result of their now-known status, served as yet another reminder of how differently the entire airport experience might have gone had their credentials been recognized or simply respected from the spot beginning. As the aircraft descended through cloud layers toward Atlanta, Isaiah's secure phone buzzed with a final message before the mandatory power down. It was from Geneva, the UN Secretary General's office, crisis escalating. Refugee numbers doubled overnight. Military forces at highest alert. Your expertise critically needed. Diplomatic suite prepared at Intercontinental. Security team will meet plane in Atlanta. The message refocused both Isaiah and Zara on the mission ahead, a stark reminder that while their personal experience at Reagan National deserved attention and accountability, thousands of lives hung in the balance of the diplomatic negotiations awaiting them in Geneva. We'll need to review the latest intelligence during the Atlantic crossing, Isaiah noted, already mentally shifting from the airport incident to international crisis mode. I'll request secure updates as soon as we board in. Atlanta Zara agreed, closing her laptop as the descent continued. As the aircraft's landing gear deployed with a mechanical thud, Isaiah reached over and briefly squeezed Zara's hand, a private gesture of partnership that had carried them through countless professional challenges and personal trials. "Ready?" he asked simply. "Always," she replied, with the quiet confidence that had made her one of the State Department's most respected voices on human rights law. The plane touched down in Atlanta, where another leg of their journey awaited, both the literal flight to Geneva and the ongoing navigation of a world still struggling to reconcile the America of its ideals with the America of its ideals. Reality. 6 months after the incident at Reagan National Airport, Isaiah and Zara Washington stood at the East Room podium in the White House. The distinctive blue and white presidential seal prominently displayed before them. President David Monroe stood to the side, applauding along with the assembled dignitaries, press corps, and specially invited guests. For exceptional service to the United States and unwavering dedication to peaceful resolution of international conflicts, the military aide had just read, "The President of the United States awards the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Ambassador Isaiah Washington and Special Counsel Zara Washington." As the president placed the iconic star-shaped medals around their necks, the significance of the moment resonated throughout the room. In diplomatic circles, the story of what had happened after that fateful day at the airport had become something of a legend. How the Washingtons had boarded their connecting flight in Atlanta with an elite security detail flown to Geneva on a diplomatic aircraft and stepped immediately into one of the most tense international negotiations of the decade. The Washingtons arrived in Geneva and went straight to the conference table. Without even stopping at their hotel, President Monroe remarked during his speech. Within 48 hours, they had negotiated a ceasefire that prevented what intelligence analysts unanimously agree would have become a devastating regional conflict with global implications. What the president didn't mention, though everyone in the room knew, was how the Washingtons had accomplished this diplomatic miracle while videos of their airport confrontation circulated worldwide, becoming a focal point in Times. Discussions about racial bias and credential skepticism in America. After the ceremony concluded and the formal reception began, Thomas Harrington, CEO of Atlantic Airways, approached the couple with calculated deference. The airline executive had spent the past 6 months navigating the corporate fallout from the incident involving his employee. Ambassador Washington, Special Counsel Washington, he greeted them with practiced humility. "Congratulations on this well-deserved honor." "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." Isaiah responded with diplomatic professionalism. "I understand your company has been making some significant changes." Harrington nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. The Diplomatic Traveler Recognition Program you helped us develop has been implemented across all our North American hubs. Every gate agent and security liaison now receives mandatory training in credential recognition and implicit bias awareness." And Miss Reed Zara inquired, referencing the gate agent whose actions had triggered the confrontation. "After completing extensive sensitivity training and educational programs, she's actually become one of our most effective trainers," Harrington explained. "Her first-hand experience has proven instructive for other staff members." Across the room, Secretary of State William Bennett engaged with journalists, carefully addressing questions about the incident's broader implications. What happened to Ambassador and Special Counsel Washington wasn't just about 2 individuals, he stated firmly. It was a systemic failure that required a systemic response. That's why the State Department has implemented comprehensive new protocols for diplomatic travelers across all domestic transportation hubs. The secretary didn't mention the less public but equally significant internal memo he had issued directing diplomatic security to review racial disparity patterns in credential verification incidents involving diplomatic personnel, a review that had already resulted in procedural changes and accountability measures throughout the department. Near the refreshment table, officers James Wilson and Keith Dawson, now former airport security officers, stood somewhat uncomfortably in civilian attire. Their presence at the ceremony had been specifically requested by the Washingtons in a gesture that had surprised many. Ambassador Wilson acknowledged nervously as Isaiah approached him. "I appreciate the invitation, though I'm not sure I deserve to be here." "That's precisely why you needed to be here, Mr. Wilson," Isaiah replied evenly. "Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about growth and transformation. I understand you've taken a new position." Wilson nodded, his posture reflecting both humility and determination. "Yes, sir. After the incident, I enrolled in courses on law enforcement bias at Georgetown. I now work with the new Federal Aviation Administration program on security protocol reform and using your experience to help others avoid similar mistakes," Isaiah noted with approval. "That's how change happens." Nearby, Melanie Reed, the former gate agent whose actions had initiated the entire confrontation, stood in conversation with Zara. Unlike Wilson Reed's journey had been more complicated, involving initial defensiveness that had gradually transformed into genuine remorse and commitment to change. "The Foundation training program has been life-changing," Reed was explaining earnestly, "working with young people of color who aspired to diplomatic careers. It's opened my eyes in ways I never expected. That's why we established the Diplomatic Pathways Initiative," Zara responded, "to ensure the next generation of American representatives reflects the full diversity of American experiences." The foundation she referenced had grown exponentially in the months following the airport incident, fueled by corporate donations, beginning with Atlantic Airways' substantial apology contribution and expanded through a State Department matching program. What had started as a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing international relations degrees had evolved into a comprehensive pipeline program with internships, mentoring, and direct pathways to diplomatic positions. President Monroe joined their conversation, accompanied by Isaiah and Miles Washington, who had flown in from Yale for the ceremony. "Mrs. Washington," the president said warmly, "your son was just telling me about his thesis on domestic application of diplomatic frameworks. Sounds like he might follow in his parents' footsteps." With some important differences, I hope Miles responded with the thoughtful articulation he'd inherited from both parents. Their generation had to break through doors. Mine should be focused on ensuring those doors never close again. As the reception continued, Isaiah received a discreet message from his assistant. It was time for their interview with National Public Radio, part of a carefully scheduled media tour designed to maximize the impact of their story and the Habag initiatives it had inspired. "You've both received the highest civilian honor our nation bestows," the interviewer began once they were seated in a quiet room adjacent to the East Room. "Yet 6 months ago you were treated with suspicion and disrespect at a domestic airport. How do you reconcile those experiences?" Isaiah and Zara exchanged the brief glance that had become familiar to those who worked closely with them. A silent communication developed through decades of partnership. "America has always contained contradictions," Isaiah answered thoughtfully. "The same country that elevated us to diplomatic positions can still subject us to indignities based on appearance. The challenge isn't choosing which America is real, they both are. The question is which America we're collectively working toward. And has anything fundamentally changed since the incident?" the interviewer pressed. "Change happens in layers," Zara responded. "The airline implemented new training protocols. The State Department revised diplomatic travel procedures. Our foundation has expanded opportunities for underrepresented groups in international relations. But the most significant impact Isaiah added might be the conversations happening in places where they weren't happening before. From corporate boardrooms to airport security briefings, people are asking different questions about whose credentials get questioned and whose don't. When the interview concluded, they returned to the reception where Miles was engaged in animated conversation with several young congressional staffers about diplomatic approaches to domestic policy challenges, the very topic of his thesis. "He's truly your son," Secretary Bennett remarked with appreciation as they watched Miles articulate a nuanced point about negotiation frameworks. "He is," Zara agreed. "Though hopefully his generation won't need to carry the same dual burdens we did." As the White House reception wound down, Isaiah received a message that their diplomatic vehicle was ready. They had another flight to catch, this time to South Sudan, where their expertise had been requested for peace negotiations. At Reagan National Airport, the difference in their experience was immediately apparent. They were greeted by name at the diplomatic entrance, now fully operational, escorted by security personnel trained under the new protocols and treated with the professional respect their positions warranted. As they approached the gate for their connecting flight to Addis Ababa, a new agent, one who had completed the credential recognition program implemented after their incident, immediately identified their diplomatic passports. Ambassador and Special Counsel Washington. She greeted them with appropriate deference. "Your diplomatic suite on the aircraft is prepared. We're honored to have you aboard." Isaiah and Zara exchanged a brief glance that acknowledged the contrast with their previous experience. Though both understood that individual improvement, while welcome, didn't equate to systemic change. Their work, both diplomatic and domestic, would continue with each airport, each negotiation, each interaction, either reinforcing old patterns or helping to establish new ones. "Ready?" Isaiah asked, echoing the same question he had posed 6 months earlier as they had prepared to disembark in Atlanta. "Always," Zara replied, her answer unchanged, despite everything that had transpired since. Together they proceeded down the jet bridge as representatives of an imperfect nation, striving toward its higher ideals, the contradictions and complexities of America embodied in their very journey, their challenges, and ultimately their impact. This powerful story illustrates that even the highest credentials and achievements cannot fully shield people of color from racial bias. Despite their Harvard degrees, diplomatic status, and direct line to the president, Isaiah and Zara, Washington still faced suspicion and hostility based solely on their appearance. The incident reveals how implicit bias operates on multiple levels, from individual interactions to systemic procedures that fail to protect against discrimination. True change requires action at every level: individual accountability, corporate policy reform, institutional protocols, and societal awareness. The transformation of Melanie Reed from biased gate agent to diversity trainer demonstrates how confronting our prejudices can lead to growth. Meanwhile, the Washington's decision to create educational pathways for underrepresented groups shows how personal experiences of discrimination can fuel positive systemic change. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that the journey toward equality involves both acknowledging America's contradictions and actively working to resolve them, recognizing both the progress made and the distance still to travel. Have you or someone you know ever been unfairly judged based on appearance rather than credentials? We want to hear your story. Comment below with your experience and how you handled it. Did you speak up or stay silent? What would you do differently today? If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about overcoming discrimination and creating positive change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how bias impacts everyday interactions, even for those at the highest levels of achievement. Remember, change happens when we recognize bias in ourselves and others. Thank you for watching, and may we all contribute to building a world where people are truly judged by their character and credentials, not by assumptions based on appearance.